Hey everyone, more disturbing information, this time coming out of the CBC in regards to your thought leaders and your political overlords. Now they've got plans for you, all right. And if you already think they control too much of your social and economic lives, well, hold on, because they're nowhere near done yet. Headline of the CBC News, under the entertainment section, for some reason, which most people aren't going to be paying attention to that segment, that section on the CBC News website. Most people are going to the news of the day, the big stuff, the big articles. Why CBC chose to put this in the entertainment section when the implications are so profound? Well, once again, we are talking about the CBC at the end of the day, Canada's propagandist arm of the federal government. Headline, Independent panel report calls for more Canadian streaming content and an ad-free CBC. Heritage Minister had said legislation could be coming within a year. This being reported by Ellie Glasner, January 29th, 2020. A sweeping new report on Canada's broadcasting and telecommunications sector is calling for widespread regulatory reform, including mandated Canadian content on streaming services and an ad-free CBC. You got that right. Mandated Canadian content, as enforced, compelled. The report, commissioned by the federal government and released today, was drafted by a 7-member panel led by Janet Yale, a broadcasting and telecommunications industry veteran. In 2018, the panel was tasked with reviewing federal legislation dealing with broadcasting and telecommunications, along with the CBC and the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, the CRTC. The panel gathered submissions from more than 2,000 stakeholders, public and private broadcasters, and tech giants such as Google and Netflix. The panel's task was to suggest updates to regulations drafted before the age of dial-up. Its report recommends, among other things, working toward the goal of universal broadband access for all Canadians, requiring media curators such as Netflix to invest in Canadian programming, So once again, forcing those streaming services that you and I use, forcing them to put content on that service that you don't want nor desire. How very authoritarian of them, making the CBC into a publicly funded service free of advertising. So what that says to me is, yeah, they're not going to be having to worry about ad revenue, even though right now it's very tiny in comparison to the already massive public subsidies forced and thrust on us all. It's not like we get the choice. It's not like we get to voluntarily opt in to support the CBC. We're all forced to the tune of what? $1.2 billion per year. We're all forced to pay for this propagandist arm of the federal government, which is already an infringement on our inherent rights and freedoms and completely immoral. But now they want to ramp up that spending even further, which means plundering the wallets and purses of Canadians even further. Combining the Canada Media Fund and Telefilm Canada into a new publicly funded entity. Oh, they really want to have complete control over everything you see and hear. Yeah, that term programming, it definitely has a double entendre. And they want to make sure that the federal government, in conjunction with the media organizations in this country, have complete control over everything you see and hear or consume in the media landscape. How Orwellian can you get? Strengthening and re-imaging the role of the CRTC to make all media providers, from conventional broadcasters to online curators, subject to its jurisdiction. You'll respect my authority! And those of you who are outside of it now, well, I'm coming for you. That's the message I'm getting from that particular part of this article. The panel said that significant disparities remain between high-speed broadband access in urban areas and in rural regions. The longer these gaps continue, the further behind those living in northern and remote geographies become in terms of the communications infrastructure required to flourish in the 21st century, the report said. The question is one of nation building. Not a Netflix tax, but one of the most contentious questions facing the panel was whether to bring foreign streaming services such as Netflix and Amazon Prime under the Canadian regulatory umbrella. While streaming services are increasingly popular with Canadians, they don't have to obey the regulatory requirements imposed on traditional Canadian broadcasters, such as meeting Canadian content quotas and paying into the Canadian Media Fund, which finances and supports the creation of Canadian media content. The panel report calls on the federal government to require streaming services to devote a portion of their program budgets to Canadian programs. Give me your money or else. Netflix objects to the idea of paying into the Canadian Media Fund. In its submission to the panel, the streaming giant argues that since it's a foreign company, it can't draw on the fund to produce Canadian content for its service. The panel should consider carefully the merits and implications from a public policy perspective of drawing foreign global online services into what was designed to be a domestic closed circle of support, Netflix's submission to the panel said. Netflix also takes issue with the way Canadian content is classified. It cites the show Travelers, which it said started out as a joint production with Canadian broadcasters and qualified as Canadian content, but once Netflix took over the show on its own, the production no longer met the standard. We all have a role to play in supporting the future of film and television being created in Canada, a spokesperson for Netflix said today. We look forward to working with the government as it proceeds to modernize Canada's broadcasting and telecommunication laws. The local industry is flourishing. We will continue investing in made-in-Canada productions and stories, bringing them to the world. Now listen to this part, folks. Past federal governments have resisted calls to apply consumption taxes to foreign streaming services. The report insists it is not recommending that Canadian content be supported by the so-called Netflix tax. Instead, it suggests forcing streaming services themselves to invest in Canadian programming that they believe will attract and appeal to Canadians. The goal, according to the panel, would be to support Canadian cultural policy objectives without causing subscription rates to rise. It's not necessarily the case that it's going to increase their program budgets. What we're saying is that a portion of those program budgets, which are significant, must qualify as Canadian, Yale said. We do not think that is something that would be passed on to the consumers or result in higher prices. The report also calls for applying GST/HST to foreign online services. Netflix currently pays provincial tax only in Saskatchewan and Quebec. So you get that, right? A little bit of a misdirection there. At first, it almost seemed like they weren't recommending a tax. But down here, it says the report calls for applying a tax, which, yes, will make it more expensive. And even all this pretense that if they force these streaming services to provide Canadian content, well, you don't think these streaming services are going to pass those costs that they have to incur onto the end consumer? Of course they are. They're a business. They want to be profitable. And what always happens when government forces corporations to have to pony up money to government coffers, well, those corporations ultimately always pass those costs on to you, the end consumer. So anyways, folks, I'll place a link to this article in the description of the video below. I'm kind of at my wit's end here these days. I don't know what to do. And most Canadians don't seem to care too much to fight back against any of this stuff. I don't know what it's going to take. But maybe when you start affecting the cost of those distractions that most Canadians use these days to not have to face up to reality, maybe that will be the final nail in the coffin or the final wake-up call that will stir Canadians' minds and start to actually think about what's taking place out there. It's Canadian Libertarian, and I love liberty.